Chapter 13 of The Airplane Boys Among the Clouds. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Yoganan. The Airplane Boys Among the Clouds by John Luther Langworthy. The Challenge. Frank laughed heartily so that Andy turned toward him in surprise. Of course, it was silly to think of such a thing as a bomb in connection with the object Sandy had dropped. Then again, Frank had seen that it was bound to fall at some little distance away from the shed. He also caught the unmistakable flutter of paper and could give a pretty accurate guess as to what it all meant. "It's dropped, Frank, and didn't go off," exclaimed Larry, having himself been more or less influenced with the panic into which timid Elephant had fallen. Frank started forward as if bent upon approaching the object that lay upon the ground, while the biplane was now heading straight away as if it might be the intention of the pilot to seek new pastures. "Be careful, Frank," called out Larry. "Yes, go mighty slow, please," added Elephant, thrusting his head out from cover, much as a cautious old tortoise might do to see if the coast were clear. They saw Frank reach the object and immediately pick it up. He seemed to be examining it with more or less interest. "Why, I declare if I don't believe it's only a block of wood after all," remarked Larry in disgust. "Sure it is. Anybody could see that," declared Elephant, who had managed to slide out from under the woodpile most adroitly and was rubbing his cheeks to induce a return of his customary color. "Frank's reading something, fellows," cried Andy. "I know what it must be. And just like that sassy Carberry to send it in that way. He wants to do everything just like he was on the stage, you know." "A challenge," burst out Larry. "Sure thing," piped up Elephant, grinning now and ready to make it appear that he had guessed this from the very first and that his actions had been in the light of a huge joke. Frank had turned around now and was approaching them, still engrossed in what he had found on the paper Sandy had dropped, with a heavy block of wood to carry it direct to the earth. "What is it, Frank?" asked his cousin. "Yes, tell us before we burst, please," Elephant pleaded. "Me too," said Larry, feeling that he ought to be heard. Do it, Frank." "All right, fellows," replied the other, nodding and smiling, as if something had pleased him. "Suppose we sit down on that long bench in front of the shed." He had no sooner dropped upon the wooden settee than there were a couple of eager boys hanging over either shoulder. "It's a challenge, all right," said Andy, his eyes sparkling. "Yes, that's where you hit the nail on the head," replied the other. "And like everything that Percy manages, it is gotten up in a way to sting. We might decline an ordinary everyday challenge, but he manages to fix it so that you have just got to accept or be set down as afraid." "Huh! No danger of our not taking him up on anything that's halfway fair," said Andy promptly. "And now suppose you read it out to us, Frank." "Here goes then. He's got it headed, 'A Challenge,' and then right below he gets down to business in this way: 'Frank Bird and Andy Bird, Aviators.'" "Wow!" cried Larry. "That sounds all the good. But he's giving you the taffy only because he wants to claim the same title himself, and so, Frank, you'll see presently. Here's the way he goes on, fellows. Greeting. I hereby challenge you to a trial of skill and speed with their respective biplanes, same to take place within 3 days from date, at an hour to be selected mutually. Set test to include first a 30-mile straightway race and circle the Liberty Pole on the Commons at Hazenhurst. Next, altitude to be decided by the barograph carried on each biplane, then 3 times around the peak of Old Thundertop. And finally, the feat of volplaning from the greatest height to land on Bloomsbury High School campus. Other rules for this race to be arranged between us at a meeting to be held later on. If you decline to accept this challenge, I propose to go over the aforesaid schedule alone and claim a victory." And underneath it all, he signs himself Percy Carberry, Aviator. The boys looked at each other. "Sounds like a real good test, Frank," suggested Larry cautiously. "Just what I was going to say," Elephant put in, watching Frank's face and seeing what he considered favorable signs there. "And I move for one that the challenge be immediately accepted so that further arrangements may be made," Andy observed grimly. "Well," remarked Frank slowly, "we'll consider it. As a rule, you know, fellows, I am not much in favor of racing when there is so much danger involved, but just as I said a bit ago, Percy knows how to fix things so as to stick pins in you. He's written his challenge in a way that makes us accept or be branded for cowards. Oh, he needn't have worried about that, cried Andy angrily. If he knows anything about the bird boys, he ought to make sure they never take water. Didn't we see whatever he did before and go him one better? And down in the land of revolution, he knows who carried off the honors as well as saved him from those men who had him in their power. Frank, we have just got to do it. I suppose so, Andy, returned his cousin. But if you think that another win on a part is going to close Percy up like a clam, you are way off. It makes me think of a medicine ball. Every time you hit it and send it flying, it comes back again as chipper as ever. It just won't stay down, that's all. I don't agree with you there, said Andy. If we can only rub it into him hard enough, Percy will never have the nerve to hold up his head again in Bloomsbury. But we can't expect to do that, Frank went on. He seems to have a splendid mission there, and that will make us hustle all we know how to pass ahead. And even you give the fellow credit for knowing his business. He's a bird boy, all right, even if his name happens to be Carberry. No overconfidence, Andy. That has lost any number of races that ought to have been won hands down. Oh, I understand that, Frank, the other said. But I believe in you, and that Perk ain't the same class. Count on him to make a mistake when the crisis comes. And if he thinks he's going to be passed there, ain't any low-down trick he wouldn't be guilty of. I leave it to Larry, Nat, and Elephant if that isn't right. And if he thinks he's going to be passed there, ain't any low-down trick he wouldn't be guilty of. I leave it to Larry, Nat, and Elephant if that isn't right. I've known him to do lots of mean things, spoke up Elephant promptly. And if I had to enter a race with him, I tell you right now, I'd keep out of his reach, all right. The best way is to get the lead in the start and never let him come within striking distance. Then you could snap your fingers at his games, declared Larry. Say, there is something in that, Frank, Andy admitted. I believe it, returned the other young aviator. The only trouble I can see is that Percy usually starts off the furious rush and takes the lead. He believes it gives him an advantage, and perhaps it does. Every fellow has his pet theories in a race, and no two of them may be alike. I guess the main idea with him is that he can get in some of his dirty work if he sees the other is passing him, and he sneered. Frank shook his head at him, but on the whole did not know that he could blame Andy for feeling so bitterly toward the other. Their experiences with Percy in the past had been far from pleasant, and many times had he attempted some unscrupulous game that had stirred Andy's fighting blood to the boiling point. As for Sandy Hollingshead, Andy's opinion of him as a sneak was known to every boy in Bloomsbury, nor did the party most interested seem to care to knock off the chip aggressive Andy had long carried on his shoulder. The aeroplane had vanished beyond the high fringe of trees. Possibly Percy had headed for town to show off his new purchase to the gaping Bloomsbury crowds, certain to come rushing from houses and stores as soon as the word was passed around that a flying machine was hovering overhead. As the afternoon passed, the boys debated pro and con concerning the challenge. Frank had agreed to accept, much to the delight of the others, and his answer was carefully prepared so as to cover every point in question. He and Daddy realized that, after all, their prediction as to a storm had failed, for the clouds seemed to have passed away, leaving the day hotter than ever. Phew, ain't I glad, though, I can camp on a night like this, said Elephant, as started in to assist Larry get dinner ready. Just what I was thinking, added the chief cook, looking up from his task with a grin of pleasure. I've got the peskiest hot room ever on a still summer night like this is going to be. Right under the roof, cold as born in winter, roasting in July and August. Say, I've often said they'd find me fried like a donut some fine morning, or froze stiff. This thing just suits me to a whiz. Heard Frank ask the colonel to eat with us tonight, so I suppose we're going to have an extra good spread, Elephant went on, scraping the potatoes industriously. That's what, chuckled the other. Just leave it with your uncle, and the chances are you won't be disappointed much. I like good things myself. Used to say I was going to study to be a great chef when I grew up. May yet, who knows? What's Frank and Andy doing with that wire right now? Why, you see, the colonel made him promise to connect him with the shed. So in case any row happened to be pulled off here, he'd know it. Hard for him to understand he's out of the game with that triple leg. He's been doing things all his life. I think he's the most wonderful old codger I ever knew. And that's where you're just about right, Larry. We must make him tell us some of his travel yarns tonight, while we sit around, Elephant declared. End of chapter 13.